All right, so next up is Lee Howard from Time Warner Cable. He's done analysis of both policies and adoption of IPv6 and web and access networks, and has some suggestions about the impact for public policy.
I'm going to make you king, or queen, as the case may be. Congratulations. Now that you're supreme monarch of your nation, some citizen comes to you and says, what are you doing about IPv4 runout? How do you respond? Well, maybe you go to your Ministry of Communications, or maybe you go to your humble vizier. Myself and now it's Dr. Jesse Soul, as of the past couple of days. Congratulations to him. We are happy to present some counsel to you on some things that you might do based on what other countries have done. Your first question, Your Majesty, might be, is this actually a public policy issue? Is this something that we need to worry about? We in the royal we sense. My answer would be, maybe. This is up to you. IPv4 is the status quo, but the status quo is changing. And I've demonstrated in previous talks about how costs will rise, that TCO of CGN costs money, there's an address market. And what you might mostly be worried about, and this is what some other countries have demonstrated concern about, is that the deployment of IPv6 might be costly or hurried or islandy, to make up a word. Those costs are obviously, how much it costs in hardware, but also mostly in knowledge and the opportunity cost of prioritizing v6 deployment over anything else that your industries might do. That hurriedness may tend to make things error-prone if people start too late and realize they need to rush. That islandy term I get from actually the case of Singapore, where they have a no islanding policy, where they want to make sure that anybody that their companies inside their country can reach any part of the internet, whether it's v4 or v6, and not have islands of disconnectivity. So that's pretty important. And one of the things that you might want to pay attention to is coordinating the deployment of IPv6 to some extent in order to maximize the network effect. That is to say, that if somebody has deployed v6, they want to maximize the benefit that they get from IPv6, which is that network effect. And so some coordination might help there. Maybe there's something that you can do. So what has happened? How has deployment happened over the course of the internet? Well, there's this really interesting visualization. I love charts that turn out pretty. So actually, this is, Jesse took some data over time of web deployment among various countries. Now, the x-axis is the proportion of countries, the x-axis is the percent of websites supporting IPv6, and the y-axis is the density, the number of countries for that percentage that supports v6. So, for instance, at 5%, a very high number of countries have 5% of their top 50 websites supporting v6. And as you go out along that x-axis, a very small number of countries has 40%. But you can see, especially the top countries, you can't see because it's too small, but you can see that the top countries have moved from over there at the 5%, have moved across the x-axis because now they have a much higher percent of their websites supporting v6. What we wanted to do, each line here represents one day and how many countries that day had top websites supporting v6. And what we were looking for is where there are sudden jumps, where there's white space. So anytime that you see a wide volume under the curve, that means more countries have more support. That's good. That bright red line is world IPv6 launch. That's when a whole lot of sites suddenly supported v6. That's great. And then we noticed a couple of other sort of clusters of days where suddenly traffic moved and moved out to the right, meaning more countries had a higher percentage. Those turned out to be Cloudflare turning on, doing major activations of v6. So there's one company. So maybe one thing that Your Majesty should consider is talking to Cloudflare and seeing what they did. There seems to be some direct input just from that one company. Now let me talk about what a government might be able to do. So there are basically three, as we observed various countries' deployments, we observed three different kinds of sets of things that happen. The first is direct policy efforts, things that governments can do themselves just because they are the government. So that's the sort of thing that a monarch could decree is going to happen. Then there are partnerships with public-private partnerships, hybrid policy areas. And then in this final case, we talk about the charismatic policy entrepreneur within both individual companies, firms, and within the operational epistemic community. There's some jargon there that I'm going to have to come back to and explain what I mean by that when I talk about that. So let me first say, what can a country do to promote IPv6? Well, there are basically three sets of things you can do. One, you can do the direct government's effort of requiring government websites and services to run over v6. Sounds familiar? You can provide some kind of incentives or requirements for private industry to support v6, or you can provide funding even, maybe pay companies to deploy v6. We've actually seen some cases with each of those. So let's look at what's actually worked. So here's a list of countries with high adoption of IPv6 among their top 50 websites. This is from Eric Vinke's site, and I've specifically listed the top, so there are several countries tied there, and I left out a couple of countries that I didn't think had especially interesting cases. So some of these countries let me go ahead and explain. There's a policy type which coordinates or correlates to what's on the right side. In some of these countries, there's a small group of companies that has deployed v6, and that's what matters. In others, there's a single company that's made a big difference. And then I've got the percentage of the top 50 websites that support v6, and then their ranking overall. So the Czech Republic is the #1 country in the world for web deployment of IPv6, when you're looking at the top 50 websites. 34% of their websites support v6. Okay, 34%, that's pretty good. What kind of policy do they have? Well, they specifically require government services to be available over IPv6. And cz.nic has done a really great, nic.cz has done a great job of providing reports ongoing about which government sites support v6. Pretty impressive. So there's a specific case. The US is #3. They also specifically require government services to be available over IPv6. And then I should go ahead and show you what I've circled. Singapore also requires v6 to be available for all government services. Now you can argue that, well, but we haven't achieved 100%. But there's been some success here, and what the correlation looks like, it's when a government requires their web services, their websites to be available over v6, they go to their hosting provider who says, well, we've never done v6 before. We have to go to our transit providers and get v6. They have to deploy v6, and there's an awful lot of work that somebody for the government is getting paid to do to push this rock uphill. When the next private company comes in and says, dual stack our website for us, they go, sure, we've done that before, no problem. And so the first site is really hard, and after that becomes much easier. So there may be some correlation there, some reason why government services should be available over IPv6, and there may be, and that may make a difference. In the case of Singapore, so there are two other incentives that I've listed here that sort of the things that governments specifically can do. They can require companies to provide IPv6 for their websites, and they can even provide money for them. I only know of two countries that have done either of these. Singapore, which you can see listed here, has both required v6 as part of its no islanding principle, and China, which isn't even listed here because very, very few websites in China support IPv6, at least that we can see externally. And that's partly because they haven't made a focus of web content. I'll give them credit there. Now, Singapore has also actually paid some of the transition costs for certain countries, for certain companies. So, for instance, they said they paid for their IDA paid for one bank to support IPv6, so that when e-commerce sites tried to go support IPv6, there would already be a bank that was available that could support that service. So that was their strategic effort to make sure that they're removing obstacles for the next companies. However, they're still tied at #6, 22% of websites. I'm not sure. This is up to you. You're the king or queen. You can decide whether this is an important strategy that you need to undertake. And we do note that China isn't listed here. But what about ISPs? Is there a correlation for ISPs? Well, here's a list of many of the top countries in terms of number of consumers that support IPv6. I've included a couple that aren't really in the top because they're also, I think, interesting use cases. And I'll tell some stories as we go along. So Belgium is obviously far and away the top country for IPv6 deployment among consumers. I'm going to say that again. Unless you're from Belgium, your country is far behind Belgium in terms of v6 deployment. So what have they done? They had an incredible effort where they got together the communications ministry, the national police, and even the equivalent of the Commerce Department, the Economic Authority, and the ISP Association. And they talked about, well, is this important? What needs to happen here? Law enforcement was very concerned about carrier-grade NAT, and they said it's illegal under EU law. That's an IP address is personally identifiable. Therefore, it must be personally identifiable, and if it's shared among other users, then it's not personally identifiable anymore. Well, nobody else has had that reading, but it's a very interesting reading. The Economic Authority and the Telecom Authority all said, well, this V4 runout problem is a competitive problem. So a new market entrant would not have IPv4 addresses. They would have to either go buy addresses, thus increasing the cost of providing competition and providing an economic advantage, an anti-competitive advantage for the incumbents, or they'd have to provide CGN, which is also expensive and provides potentially a lower quality of service for those customers. So they required V6 of all ISPs, and they allowed for a 16-to-1 address sharing ratio temporarily to help companies get along that way. So Belgium is unique in that regard, and you can see it's been very, very effective in terms of their deployment of IPv6. I note that the two incentives that I talked about there were the cybersecurity concern about address sharing making law enforcement more difficult, and the net neutrality competition effort, making sure that new entrants to the market could compete with the already existing providers. Pretty interesting. So here I've got circled again the rest of the rest of the government direct policies for top ISPs. We've already talked about U.S. government does require V6 for web services. Not sure that's had a direct impact on ISP adoption. The Czech Republic, I mentioned them, and Singapore has all three of these. So it's up to you as the monarch of your country to decide which of these factors is most influential. But maybe there's some other things that we should be looking at. So if these are not necessarily clear winners among ISPs for what's driven deployment, what kinds of things are? Well, there are these hybrid public-private partnerships. And there are two essential kinds there. There's both the government as a legitimating convener, bringing in private industry and talking about IPv6. And then in some cases, we have the RIR as a quasi-governmental or as a policy entrepreneur, in some cases working with government, and in some cases acting as a national authority to bring some legitimacy to those meeting conventions. In both cases, part of the goal, and I think this is part of the important goal, is bridging the gap between the engineer and the CEO, CTO, CFO, COO, the C-level suite. Because I can be pretty confident that people in this room, the network engineers in this room, know that IPv4 is running out at ARIN. That's probably a safe assumption. That does not mean that the CEOs for every company represented in this room know that IPv4 is running out and what that means to their company. So some of these things are, how do we bridge that gap in communication between those two levels of the company? So here again, list of ISPs, and talk about first government as a legitimating convener. In Belgium, I talked about the example there where the government, several different ministries in the government brought together the ISPs and worked together. Singapore, I talked there, they also brought in, and they did a lot of training too among the private industry. And Slovenia. Slovenia is, we can specifically look to that example as a country where one particular person, Jan George, went to the government and said, this is important to us as a country. And they said, wow, it sure is. How much money do you need? And he said, I don't need money. I need you to send some invitations on letterhead to the CEOs of all the internet companies and bring them into a meeting and ask them what their plan is for IPv6. And therefore, the CEOs said, what's IPv6? And had to go talk to their engineers and say, I need to have something to say. What do I say when I get there? And so that helped them have something to say. And then they all got together in a room and sat and looked at each other. And those who didn't have anything constructive to say about IPv6 were a little bit embarrassed. And so then they kept having meetings every 6 months where these companies would get together and talk about their plans for V6. And the ones who had nothing to say were kind of, clearly quiet. That was a little bit embarrassing for them. So we also have the RIRs as policy entrepreneurs going out to both the national governments and in some cases, in many cases, going to the local ISPs and the local operators to talk about V6 deployment. LACNIC, obviously the three cases I have circled here are LACNIC cases, has done a bang-up job of reaching out to companies throughout their region. In the case of, I think it was Bolivia in particular, they were going to have a meeting of the IXP, or about forming an IXP, and they said, well, gee, while we have the right people in the room, let's also talk about IPv6. And so they were able to get a lot of IPv6 allocations made in that country and get a lot of people concerned and thinking about what their transition plan would be. Having said that, you're the king. You can decide how much of an impact those particular cases have had on overall IPv6 adoption among ISPs. So if it's the case, and I'm not certain that it is, but if it's the case that direct government and partnership government practices aren't the primary drivers of IPv6, what is? What has happened that has been the primary thing where we can say that happened, therefore we have IPv6 adoption? Well, we need to look at what are the incentives that drive people to enable IPv6 for their companies. And there are basically two. There's money and there's prestige. So in the first case, the money tends to be more individual firms where companies, network operators, whether it's ISP or web content or cloud or hosting, where those companies determine on their own that they have financial incentives for deploying IPv6. In other cases, we have what we're calling operational epistemic communities. And this is a term that comes from older scientific bodies and academic communities where there are bodies of knowledge sort of held by particular bodies. In our case, it's operational, the epistemic communities because of correspondence. These are communities that primarily take place over mail. Well, so a community that primarily exists as a mailing list might sound familiar, and there might in fact be some correlation between mailing list operator communities and deployment of V6. And we can point to specific individuals who have affected change and affected IPv6 policy changes as our IPv6 policy entrepreneurs. So within an operational epistemic community, we can say, if you bring clue, if you bring knowledge to the community, your prestige increases. The more information you provide, the more people ask you questions and you can provide support, you gain prestige by doing that. And in some ways, you could say that deploying IPv6 gains prestige in some of these communities. Well, what's the correlation here? Same list of ISPs. It looks like I forgot to circle the 3A next to United States. So 6 of the top 7 countries for ISP deployment, we can point to a single company that has deployed IPv6, the incumbent. So in this case, I'm going to go first to Luxembourg, Peru, Norway, Switzerland. The incumbent has deployed IPv6 for its own reasons. Nobody told them they had to. There was no requirement that they do so, except for whatever reason, somebody at that company said, we need to do V6, and they did. And the reason that these countries are so high on the list is that incumbent has a significant market share. So once one company deployed V6, that mattered to the entire country. In the other cases, United States and Germany, there is no single company that has enormous market share and who alone would move the needle to put the country in the top 10. But there's a group of companies who have all deployed V6. In the United States, you know who they are, usual suspects. They're over on all the lists. In Germany, it's the major telco incumbents and several of the cable companies have all deployed V6. And because they've all deployed V6, there's actually, in aggregate, a significant share of V6 deployed there. So there's no single company, but each individual company deployed for their own reasons. And this is the case even if we go look at World IPv6 launch. That was coordinated, but each of the companies who participated had already begun their V6 deployment. So it looks like that's not necessarily, they were doing it for their own reasons. In the other end, okay, so these epistemic communities, where do we find strong epistemic communities? In Belgium, like I mentioned, the ISP community. In the United States, which is, I would say this is a very strong operational epistemic community. You gain prestige by bringing clue to NANOG, and people love to share with you about your knowledge. The Czech Republic has a very strong operational epistemic community in the same way. Singapore, I kind of talked about theirs a little bit, and Slovenia's. So it's up to you. Let me go ahead and, so it's up to you to figure out whether that has a strong correlation or a less strong correlation with success. And finally, there are certain countries where we can point to an individual and name him, in almost every case it's him, to say that person or those couple of people have changed the policies of their firms and of their communities to support IPv6. So we know in Belgium, it's Eric Dinke and Gunther van der Veld changed the policy of the government to support IPv6. In the United States, it's many of the same people. When you think IPv6, who do you think of? Those are the people I'm talking about. In Norway, it was Ragnar at the incumbent. At the Czech Republic, it was Nick.cz, and in Slovenia, again, Jan George. We know who these people are. You can be that guy who makes a difference in the policy of your firm, your network, and even your community. So in summary, since you asked, Your Majesty, since you asked, here's what you can do. There are direct things that you can do. You can require government services to be available over V6. You can provide incentives to industry, requiring them or providing them financial incentives to deploy V6. You can work with industry to convene members of private enterprise and talk about their V6 plans. You can look to your RIRs as leaders. In some cases, those are also, by the way, NIRs. And part of what you need to be looking towards, if that's the way you're going, is closing that gap between the technical people at those private enterprises and their executive leadership. And finally, you may want to look for those charismatic V6 policy entrepreneurs, those people who have credibility in their operational epistemic communities and in their firms and can make change from within. And those are determining the firm's individual incentives, looking at the communities to provide support to each other, and finding those individuals who can bridge that gap. So what should you do? Well, that's up to you. You are the supreme monarch. It's your country. You can run it however you want to. I'm simply providing some insights on what I've seen in other countries. But governments who are desiring to foster IPv6 might want to consider requiring V6 for their websites. That seems like something where there may well be a correlation between web adoption and government support. You may want to coordinate with industry representatives to leverage the kind of operational community that supports each other in deploying things and to provide a little bit of incentive in terms of competition and prestige for deploying V6. You should also review your data retention laws and your privacy laws. So are ISPs required to or prohibited from recording where people go, where their customers go to on the web? Is there privacy requirements about addresses and about CGN logs? Are websites required to log source port and timestamp? Those kinds of concerns, and of course the Belgium example of competition. Is there available? Is it possible for people to compete in the appropriate address space? And then there's also some other observations that I've mentioned. Countries with very high deployment rates tend to have one or more large operators deploying, depending on where the market share sort of falls out for a given country. They tend to have strong operational communities like this one, and I mean generally national communities. NANOG is an exception, and it's not a specifically national community. It is more, it is regional, but it's a strong region. And they tend to have that guy, that policy entrepreneur who is promoting V6, and that's the person who gets things done. And so that would be my call to you as the monarch of your firm or your country or your fantasy land is you can be the person who makes that change within whatever your sphere of influence can be. So I would be happy to take more questions from you in your royal robes or your tiara, whatever the case. Thank you. Okay.
Hello. Tony Tauber, Comcast. Are there any other examples of technology initiatives that in the past or in the future that you think this model might apply to?
That's a very interesting question. All of this research has been, Jesse and I had put it into a paper that we originally presented at TPRC, a research conference. I forgot to include the link to the paper. It's a working paper, so there's more work to be done on it, and the data that it captures is from a point in time roughly 6 months ago. I did update these numbers for to reflect current data. Whether it applies to other technology initiatives would be sort of depends on the overall policy model, and I would probably recommend reading Jesse's PhD dissertation. Back?
Doug Montgomery, NIST. At least in the U.S. government's case, the policy is actually much broader than that. It includes all publicly accessible internet-facing services. And having handheld that for over a decade, I can certainly tell you that I think there is some deployment that policy inspired. But one of the biggest things that's a problem right now is actually getting email services up over IPv6. And the real problem there is the infrastructure of reputation services, for lack of a better name, that modern anti-spam, anti-phishing systems rely on. And I wonder if you have any comment about ways forward with those kind of technologies that don't show up in any standards body, but seem to be critical barriers to deploying other services.
Yeah, I would definitely give you credit for being one of those IPv6 policy entrepreneurs that we were talking about. I would also, I wish that I had a solution for spam. I don't. It does seem to me that there are certain assumptions that we can make. Maybe there may be assumptions that we can make about applying reputation from one IP address to neighboring addresses. So that, now, we don't know how many addresses, whether it's a 64 or a 60 or a 56 or a 48 in any given case. And there are things that we can do there where maybe we can start doing some correlation. It requires more CPU, more horsepower to do those computations. That's the direction that I'm sort of thinking. And I haven't written a formal submission to MOG to say, here's some things we ought to do. I've been sort of trying to work with vendors to say, how do we make this happen? And in particular, I've been trying to work with my mail and system security guys to say, how can we fight spam in V6? One of the interesting things on Eric Vinke's data is which countries have high levels of V6 deployment for email, and they tend to be countries where a lot of companies are using Google as their mail provider.
Hi, my name is Christina Chu. I'm with NTT. You have according to your study, Japan is ranked at number 12, but in the category, in the policy category, it is blank. It has, neither 1, 2, or 3. So I'm just curious, why? Do you have an explanation to that?
It's a very bad explanation, which is I had a very hard time finding an expert who could tell me about Japanese policies around V6 deployment. So because I was unable to find somebody who was fairly authoritative, I just couldn't include a comparison of their policies with regards to V6. So I would love to include more detail in Japan's policies because they have provided some significant policy leadership in the area.
Okay, and since I work for NTT,
Yes.
I knew in the mid-90s or early 90s, the Japanese government gave a great push into IPv6. They want to be, seen as a leader in the IPv6 arena. So, the reason NTT become one of the ISP launched the commercial IPv6 service, mainly because of the great push from the Japanese government. And another thing, I know, based on your ISP ranking, all this, Japan is number 12, but, if you look at the Japanese infrastructure, their earthquake alert system, it is purely IPv6. So, and NTT also have a subsidiary, it's called Hakiri TV, which also primarily run on IPv6. And it is a closed network, so probably because you didn't see it because it's a closed network. So in Japan, there's actually, IPv6 is quite well developed because of the strong government push.
Yeah, that's true from what I understand, and I absolutely agree with you. It's a unique case because of the private deployments of IPv6, where, and I should point out that the rankings that I was showing were from Eric Vinke's data, and he's using Google's data, which measures the number of hits that they get over IPv6 compared to IPv4. So it's entirely likely that the representation of V6 deployment from Japan to Google is not representative. It may well be that Japanese users don't go to Google as much because, as they do to Japanese-oriented sites.
Okay.
So thank you. Yes.
Hi, KCDCO VeriSign. Very interesting work and data, and I look forward to the link with the rest of the results and the ongoing work. I was actually going to address Doug's question that he raised just a minute ago, so this is in partial direction to that. Back at the last NANOG, I presented some of the work that we've been doing in kind of passive measurement of SMTP spam over IPv6 and some of the correlation we were doing with IPv4 known blacklisted hosts. And that's actually work that's kind of ongoing, but we're trying to continue to get participants where possible. And the idea is, in a nutshell, to actually look at some of the IPv6 activity among known blacklisted hosts by using correlation activity between the different attempts to send spam. So slightly off topic, but in related to the general discussion of this deployment and hurdles that are there blocking IPv6 deployment or making it more difficult.
You remind me that if I were Monarch, one of the things that I would decree by rule is that all CRL and OCSP servers must support IPv6. That would be good so that we could check whether certificates are valid based when you have a v6 only system. Yes?
Angelico, Google. Just off top of my head, when you get government involved, which comes to operator or company and say, okay, I want you to support IPv6. It's quite possible that we'll just deploy something like, let's get quad A record for our web service and let it answer over to ping, for example, yeah? So I wonder if you looked at any correlation between government involvement and, let's say, IPv6 brokenness level.
The data that I remember on brokenness level is way down in the noise now compared to where it used to be. And I also ought to caveat to say that when we looked at specific policies that have been implemented, I have not adjusted for time. So some of them may be fairly recent policies that haven't had time to take effect. And I don't know, other than the China case where the Chinese government provided incentives for ISPs to deploy a certain number, to deploy IPv6 to a certain number of users, it's almost impossible for us to measure that outside of China. So it's very difficult to tell how much success they have had and what the quality of that success is. I know that from the Google data, we see fluctuations week over week from 0.5% to 4%, and knowing what the real level is almost impossible to measure. So I haven't been able to do any kind of good correlation of the quality of deployment. It's a very interesting question, though. I'd be thrilled to have suggestions on how to adjust for that. Okay, thank you all very much.